Today's material is a passionate broadcast monologue criticizing a radio host's violent rhetoric against the Haredi community and exploring the broader societal atmosphere that normalizes such language.
Yeah, it's a really intense piece of writing.
It is, and we're going to dive right into the actionable feedback. As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that the atmosphere is the real culprit, right?
Right. So elevating the role of the silent bystander could significantly deepen the thematic resonance of the piece right out of the gate.
Oh, that's an interesting angle. How so?
Well, the material opens with that genuinely shocking quote from the primary radio host, bring a Haredi so we can bash him.
Yeah, which is it's wild to even hear.
It is. And the writer vividly describes this happening while the co-host just sits by, quote, naturally, treating the subject of the violence like a piece of furniture or like a carpet.
A carpet? Right. Like it's just completely normal.
Exactly. But the weakness in the current draft is that it introduces this incredibly striking image of the unbothered co-host and then almost immediately abandons it.
Oh, it just pivots away.
Yeah. The text rapidly moves past that silence to focus almost entirely on the person who actually spoke the violent words. And then it pans out to discuss the general macro-level vibe of the public.
I see.
And by dropping the co-host's lack of reaction so quickly, the text is missing out on its most powerful psychological anchor, which is complicity.
Right, because we kind of expect a provocateur to provoke, right?
Exactly. It's practically in their job description on talk radio. So when they say something awful, the audience might be disgusted, but they aren't really surprised.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The true terror, the element that really gets under the skin of the reader, is the complicity of the person sitting right next to him.
Wow, yeah. So what is the suggestion to fix this?
The suggestion is to shift a much larger portion of the analytical focus to dissect the silence of the co-host. Use this silence as the primary vehicle to prove the point about normalization.
Emphasizing that systemic bias thrives on inaction and polite acceptance, not just overt hostility.
Yes, precisely. When the writer merely states that the co-host doesn't feel something is wrong and then hurries along, we completely lose the gravity of that inaction.
So, practically speaking, what does this look like on the page as a concrete example?
So the writer could dedicate a few lines to exploring exactly why an educated, prominent co-host wouldn't flinch.
Right, take us inside that room.
Yeah. Instead of just saying the co-host doesn't care, frame the real danger as the person nodding along. Describe the jarring contrast between the brutal imagery of physical bashing and the incredibly casual, between coffee and a chat studio setting.
Right. Paint the picture of the soundproof walls, the expensive microphones, someone bringing in lattes.
Exactly. Show the reader how the silence of the co-host is what actually sanitizes the violence. It's the silence that makes the threat palatable for thousands of people commuting in their cars.
It's like focusing on the match that started the fire rather than the dry brush that allowed it to spread.
That's a great way to put it.
But let me push back a little bit on that editorial direction.
Sure, go ahead.
If I'm the writer, I might say, well, does focusing too much on the bystander let the actual speaker off the hook?
That's clearly laid out. I wonder, though, if we've considered that focusing on the bystander actually indicts the speaker even further.
Oh, how so?
By analyzing the co-host's silence, we aren't excusing the speaker. We're actually exposing the entire infrastructure that allows that speaker to exist in the first place.
Right, because the speaker only has a microphone because the environment tolerates it.
Exactly. If you focus heavily on the silent co-host, you take away the reader's hiding place. You force them to ask, wait, would I have spoken up? Or would I have just sat there sipping my coffee?
That's a phenomenal pivot. It strips the audience of their passive observer status.
Yeah, it makes the critique completely inescapable.
Okay, so flowing directly from that idea of the dry brush or the societal atmosphere, the discussion moves to how the material outlines broader systemic pressures, right?
It does, yeah. The text broadens its scope significantly here.
Right, moving from that specific radio broadcast out into the wider world. It mentions legal sanctions, daycare subsidies, and the military draft law.
Yeah, it's an attempt to show a wide-reaching campaign against the community.
Exactly. But there's a bit of a trap here.
There is a massive trap. Separating the criticism of violent language from the debate over public policy would make the central argument much more impenetrable.
Okay, unpack that for me. What's the specific weakness?
The weakness is that the monologue conflates unacceptable physical rhetoric, literally advocating to physically bash a member of the Haredi community, with legitimate, albeit highly contentious government policy debates.
Like the draft law and the defunding of daycares.
Exactly. By mixing physical threats with political grievances, the writer gives listeners who support the draft an easy excuse to dismiss the entire monologue as just another partisan complaint.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it triggers basic cognitive dissonance.
It really does. Because if I strongly believe the draft law needs to change for the sake of national equity, and suddenly you lump my stance in with a radio host advocating street violence,
Your immediate psychological reaction isn't to agree about the violence. Your reaction is profoundly defensive.
yes, my brain shuts off its moral center and turns on its political defense mechanisms.
Right, you stop listening to the point about human rights because you're too busy defending your legislative stance in your own head.
Precisely, that is the exact mechanism of audience alienation at play. So the suggestion is to create a clear, undeniable rhetorical firewall between policy disagreements and dehumanizing language.
A rhetorical firewall, I love that terminology. You're containing the heat so it doesn't burn down your thesis.
That's exactly how it functions. You have to explicitly acknowledge that the political debates surrounding the draft and subsidies are entirely valid conversations for a society to have.
Right?
But then forcefully insist that violently dehumanizing language belongs in an entirely different, completely unacceptable category.
Insulate the core argument from the collateral damage of politics.
Yeah.
So how do we actually build that firewall on the page? What's a concrete example of that transition?
It requires a really sharp transitional pivot right when these policies are introduced. The author could insert something like, we can debate the draft, we can debate economic sanctions and daycares, but the moment policy disagreements morph into casual physical threats on the radio, we have crossed a red line.
Ooh, that immediately lowers the reader's defenses.
It does. You're explicitly stating that a listener can fully, wholeheartedly support the draft law while still being utterly disgusted by the radio host's comments.
It gives them permission to hold on to their political beliefs while still siding with your moral outrage.
Exactly. Once the reader feels that their political identity is safe, they're far more willing to engage with the actual critiques of the violent rhetoric.
That's brilliant. It's about not making your reader choose between their political tribe and your argument.
Right.
And that instinct to protect the reader from feeling alienated brings us right to the final moments of the piece, the emotional climax.
Yeah, the ending is where the stakes get raised to their absolute limit.
Let's look closely at the section discussing the conclusion. The text draws a direct line from the current treatment of the Haredi community back to 70-something years ago.
Right.
Specifically, referencing Jews arriving in the state after being burned and persecuted with burning hate.
It's a massive historical escalation.
It is.
And recalibrating the final historical analogy would prevent the core message from being entirely overshadowed by accusations of hyperbole.
Because the comparison is just too extreme for some.
Yes, that's the weakness here. Reaching for the ultimate historical extreme, the Holocaust, explicitly using the imagery of being burned, is such a massive emotional escalation that it risks breaking the trust built throughout the piece.
It turns what is fundamentally a really sharp, focused critique of modern media into a highly polarizing comparison.
It does. And the reality of modern media consumption is that many listeners will instinctively reject that comparison.
Because they feel it exaggerates present-day tensions?
Yeah, they'll feel it minimizes historical atrocities while exaggerating the present.
I can see what you're going for here. Let's see how we can strengthen this. Because, sometimes writers use these extreme historical anchors because they feel profoundly unheard.
Oh, absolutely. It's a mechanism of desperation.
Right. When arguing about daycares or radio shows doesn't move the needle, society seems to be sleepwalking, so they reach for the most universally understood symbol of persecution they have.
They're trying to shake the reader by the shoulders and say, do you see where this leads?
Exact. But your point is that it actually gives the audience an excuse to stop listening.
Yes. The tragic irony is that it rarely achieves the desired effect. By jumping back 70 years to the absolute worst atrocity imaginable, you give the skeptical reader an easy off-ramp.
An off-ramp. Right.
Yeah. The reader can sit back and say, well, you're not literally being put in camps, so you're clearly overreacting.
And just like that, the very real offense of the radio broadcast is entirely forgotten.
Exactly. Is there a risk that focusing solely on the historical trauma might overlook the very real, present-day urgency of the broadcast? Absolutely. The argument becomes a debate about history rather than a debate about violent rhetoric happening today.
So, by trying to make the argument as large as possible, we accidentally make it incredibly fragile.
We lose the modern context we worked so hard to establish.
So what is the actionable suggestion here? How do we fix the ending?
The suggestion is to ground the ending squarely in the immediate, modern-day implications of dehumanization rather than reaching for an explosive historical parallel.
Keep the focus relentlessly on the degradation of current civil society.
Yes, we need to show the audience what happens tomorrow if we accept the rhetoric of today.
Making the stakes about the society the listener currently has to wake up and live in.
Right.
Give me a concrete example of what that present-day grounding looks like in the closing paragraph.
Sure. So instead of referencing being burned 70 years ago, end on a poignant present-day reality. Something like, when we forget that the person blocking the intersection is a taxpayer, a citizen, and a human being, we erode the very foundation of our society today.
Wow, that brings it right back to the shared civic reality. It's undeniable.
Or you could use a forward-looking rhetorical question. Rhetorical questions are fantastic for conclusions because they leave the audience unsettled in their current environment.
Like what?
The writer could close by asking, if a prominent broadcaster feels comfortable saying this into a microphone today, where does this casual violence lead us tomorrow?
I love that. Where does this lead us tomorrow? That question keeps the pressure entirely on the audience's present conscience.
Exactly. It's a man's self-reflection without relying on historical extremes that might trigger a defensive reaction.
It leaves the reader staring in the mirror rather than debating history.
And it makes the silence of the co-host, and by extension, the silence of the reader, the true focal point of the danger.
All right, so to recap, we've looked at 3 high-level takeaways for this critique.
Let's run through them.
First, utilizing the silent bystander to prove the point about normalization.
Yeah, forcing the reader to confront their own potential complicity.
Second, building a strict rhetorical firewall between policy debates and violent rhetoric.
Keeping the core argument impenetrable and preventing audience alienation.
Exactly. And third, grounding the emotional climax in present-day civil society rather than historical extremes.
Because we don't want to give the audience an easy off-rip.
Right. These actionable suggestions are designed to make a strong piece even more resonant and bulletproof.
And what's so powerful is that they don't require the author to change their fundamental passion or anger.
It's purely structural reinforcement.
Exactly. It takes an impassioned argument and focuses it into something the audience simply cannot look away from.
We warmly invite the listener to implement these ideas and submit their revised work back into the show for another critique. We would absolutely love to see how this evolves on the page.